Hi, Veda. Can you hear me now?
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to episode 4 of the Global Africa-India Global Dialogue series. I'm Veda Vaidyanathan, and to kick us off today, we have Pamela Gopal. Pamela?
Thank you so much, Veda. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be welcoming you all to this 4th edition of the India-Africa Global Dialogue Series, themed Africa and the World, Reimagining Global Partnerships. I am Pamela Gopal, the head of the Policy Bridge Tank program, and it's my privilege to open this discussion today. As we gather, we find ourselves at a critical point in global history and, the shifting of global political landscape, evolving global supply chains present both challenges and significant opportunities for African nations. This webinar series is co-hosted by CSEP and the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and it aims to explore these dynamics and chart a course for Africa's future on the global stage. The AUDA-NEPAD has at the forefront been driving sustainable development across Africa. Our initiatives such as the African Medicine Regulatory Harmonization Program, as well as the Program for Infrastructure and Industrialization Development in Africa, have established local manufacturing plants and proved infrastructure, enhancing self-sufficiency and reducing dependency on external resources. Through these efforts at the agency, we aim to empower African nations to take control of their development trajectories. Our focus today will be on how African countries can establish their own foreign investors, particularly as new players like the Gulf states, Turkey, the ASEAN regions, and India increase their influence. We will also delve into long-term engagements of traditional power, such as the US, the EU, and China, and assess how recent recalibrations in the US trajectory might impact Africa's future. It is not just a conversation today about economic opportunities. It is about re-imaging partnerships that prioritize local development and strengthen African agencies, and as well as build sustainable, mutually beneficial relationships. At the African Union Development Agency, our role is in facilitating these discussions, which is crucial, by leveraging our expertise and extensive networks to ensure that the insights gained from these webinars are disseminated to every African member state, informing policies and strategies that drive meaningful change. The organization, African Union Development Agency's Policy Bridge Tank program, serves as a crucial source of continental development intelligence, engaging African think tanks as well as research institutes to identify and address regional challenges through evidence-based policy and knowledge services. The program, focuses on various content, and we would like, to have also a homegrown approach and not just reaching out to the various international, but look for meaningful content that impacts the continent at a local and regional level. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Eric Olander, who is the editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project. Eric is a veteran journalist with more than 25 years of experience, having worked across Asia, Africa, and the United States. He is widely recognized for this in-depth analysis of China's engagement with the Global South, particularly in Africa. And through the China Global South Project, Eric has built a leading platform for nuance, fact-based reporting and analysis on China-Africa relations. His work continues to shape conversations at the intersection of geopolitics, development, and international cooperation. I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Amit Jan, who is the director of the NTU SPF Center for Africa Studies at the Nanya Business School. Dr. Jan is a leading expert on Africa-Asia relations with a strong focus on trade, investment, and development issues across the continent. The center has become a vital hub indeed in Southeast Asia for research and dialogue on Africa's growing role in global economy. And I'm very happy to have you here, Amit, as we have had various discussions on our own as well in other platforms. I also take this opportunity today to welcome Labato Setoli, who is the founder of Amelia Africa, to today's webinar on Africa and the world. Labato is a dynamic entrepreneur and strategist who is passionate about reshaping Africa's global narrative through innovation, investment, and storytelling, which is, I think, very important as well, to be able to tell the story. Through Amelia's Africa, she champions African talent, creativity, and enterprise on the world stage, bridging connections between the continent and the global market. And with that, I would like to hand over to Veda, who is a fellow at the CSEP in India, and we really look forward to engaging in insightful conversations today. Over to you, Veda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you for doing all of the heavy lifting with those opening remarks. So I'm going to jump right to it. In terms of format, what we'll do is initially I'll ask 3 of the panelists open-ended questions, and then we can move on to a dialogue. Eric, let me start with you, only because you've put almost all of us on this panel in the hot seat, and it's such a pleasure to be on the other side. And you and Kobus have been writing the China and Global South, which used to be the China Africa newsletter, I think for what, a decade now?
15 years now.
Wow, 15 years. And you've been tracking all of the major geopolitical trends in the continent. You've also interviewed so many experts and scholars from the region and beyond. And at this point of time, you also happen to be American. And the US is significantly reducing its development and diplomatic operations in Africa. We saw USAID shut down. AGOA is coming up in September, possibly its expiry. At the same time, President Ruto is now on a visit to Beijing. And we saw that right after this was announced, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, canceled his planned tour of Nairobi and Addis Ababa. And in another geography, you had the EU ambassador to Egypt celebrating the official inauguration of the African Space Agency and talking vehemently about how some global actors are disengaging, but the EU is committed to the Global Gateway project. So you have so much of this happening. How have you seen, or how do you see African strategies for these major powers evolving? And what are the major shifts that you're seeing in this point in time?
Thank you, Veda, and thank you, Pamela, for the wonderful introduction. And it's really an honor to be here today to talk at this very critical time in history. And Veda, you missed one other big thing. Today, Donald Trump closed the Millennium Challenge Corporation, one of the major development finance tools that the United States used quite effectively. And it was, again, one of the tools that they used to compete against China in terms of building infrastructure. There's also talk in Washington today. Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, is hinting, although never confirmed, that the United States may withdraw from the IMF and the World Bank. There's also rumblings within the administration to withdraw from the United Nations. So we are at a precipice right now of the most dramatic change to the international order that we've seen since 1945. I don't think there's any way to exaggerate the scale of what's happening here. And countries are either going to sink or to swim. There's not going to be many in between that they'll just get by. And so when we look at President Ruto going to Beijing today, I think this is an indication of how some African countries, and again, I don't like to speak on at all about Africa because the diversity that's there is so great and so varied, and the capacities within each of these different countries vary so much in terms of their engagement strategies, not only with China, the US, India, the Emiratis, and Europe, but with others as well. So we look at William Ruto, for example, who more than other countries has been very effective at playing, both the United States, China, and Europe, not off of each other, but at the same time engaging them distinctly. And Africans have said for a very long time that they don't want to have to make a choice between the United States, China, and Europe. The United States is making it pretty clear, as we're seeing with South Africa, that may not be up to South African Africans. The choice may be made for them, either because the United States just completely disengages, or as we're hearing with South Africa, and increasingly with other countries in the developing world and the global South, and this may even come to India as well, you have to choose. It's either us or it's either them, but it can't be both. And there are scenarios that are out there where the United States will prompt countries to do that. We saw that with Panama already. We saw in Colombia got challenged with it. Chile is potentially on that list. South Africa is certainly on that list. And so countries in these regions must be prepared for these types of very stark choices that they have to make. And what are their strategies? What I would say right now is that in most African countries, it's regrettable, but it is the reality that there is not enough China capacity, China literacy, and strategic Chinese thinking. One of our colleagues in the China-Africa space, Paul Nantulia at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, he likes to point out that China has written 2 white papers in the past 5 years on Africa. Not a single African country has written a white paper on China. The time for just making it up as you go is over. This is a time for strategic thinking. This is a time for knowledge-based diplomacy. This is a time for really bringing in much wider groups of stakeholders to inform policymaking. And for a lot of African countries that are more focused on regime survival and regime stability, this is going to be a very different way of engaging in policy and doing things. But we have a situation here where many of the institutions that Africans rely on more than other regions around the world, namely World Bank, IMF, World Health Organization, UN, are in potential danger of being destabilized in ways that we just can't comprehend if the United States leaves. If the US leaves the UN, which again, there is momentum building for that, what happens? I'm in Europe right now this week, and I will be honest with you, Europeans are, in the conversations I'm having, have not internalized what it means that the United States is going to withdraw. That in 5 years, you will not see US troops in Germany anymore. These are changes, again, that are so profound. So if I can help just start our conversation today by really putting out the magnitude of the transformation, and again, not everybody's going to be a winner. And some countries are going to suffer terribly because of either their geography, their lack of resources, other internal challenges that they have, or bad policymaking in this very, very difficult time that requires very astute policymaking, and these are very challenging issues. So I'll leave it there, and then I'm looking forward to our discussions with our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for a very realist start to this conversation. Amit, if I could now move to you. You direct one of the only Center for African Studies in all of Southeast Asia. And late last year, you gave this fantastic lecture at Professor Kanti Bajpayee's class, where you identified 5 factors that countries in Africa had to look out for or watch out for: climate change, natural resources, weak state capacity, ideology, and great power competition. Now, Eric has given us a sense of what the EU, China, the US are thinking. Can you tell us a little bit about the other emerging powers getting more and more interested in Africa, the ASEAN countries, Turkey, the Gulf states? Is their growing influence overstated, or are they really and truly shaping Africa's landscape and providing an alternative that everybody's talking about?
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Veda, and thank you, Pamela. I mean, it's always great to be in this important conversation and to be with friends who I admire very much. So let me start by saying, Veda, I guess one would have to dissect and determine what that influence is and indeed how deep it is. So let me start with ASEAN. In ASEAN, there are about 200 companies that one way or the other operate across Africa. These are typically concentrated in agribusiness, palm oil production, extractive industries, some in digital trade. But if you look at the overall trade with Africa of all the 10 ASEAN countries, Southeast Asia, they constitute little more than 2%, give or take, about $60 billion. So last year, I attended the second Indonesia-Africa forums. And that saw 28 African heads of state attend the event in Bali. But that was down from 47 that attended the first event in 2018. I think I think President Prabowo, although he says Africa is close to his heart, Indonesia is not really commemorating 70 years of the historic Bandung conference this year. And this is a pity. Because it was Indonesia, after all, which was the first independent Southeast Asian country to establish diplomatic relations with any African country. They opened an embassy in Lagos in 1965. Indonesia, which is the biggest country in Southeast Asia, has a trade with Africa of only about less than $15 billion. That's less than what Singapore has with Africa, which is somewhere between 20 to 22 billion. In Singapore, there are about 155 firms working across 40 markets. Again, these are in the oil and gas, extractive, consumer, digital agribusiness, trade sectors. But curiously, Malaysia happens to be one of the most prolific investors in Africa. Its FDI stock, and I'm not talking about trade here, is almost $20 billion. Funny enough, there's something magical about this $20 billion figure. Japan's trade with Africa is around the same figure. So when it comes to Africa, really it is China that counts. But I think Singapore's Southeast Asia, Singapore, relations has a long way to go. Now coming to Turkey, its influence is something of a mixed blessing. So let me explain how. In 2009, it had only about a dozen diplomatic missions. Now it has 43 embassies across Africa. Turkish engineering firms routinely compete with the Indian firms and Chinese firms for projects. I was in Rwanda last year for the Africa CEO Forum. It was held at this fantastic Kigali Convention Center. That was built by a Turkish firm called Summa. Turkey has also constructed the Bank of Kigali Sports Arena, Amahoro National Stadium in Rwanda. Its engineering firms have transformed the face of Dakar. They've built airports there, stadiums, and even Olympic swimming pools. Uganda has signed a massive deal with a Turkish firm called Yapı Merkezi for the construction of its 200 plus kilometer section of a standard gauge railway, which incidentally, by the way, it was given to China, but taken back and given to this Turkish firm. Its mining firm, MTA, is looking for gold in Niger. In Algeria, Turkish petroleum companies are looking for oil. Turkish airline, which flew only to 4 African cities, now flies to over 40. So Turkish trade with Africa now tops $30 billion. That's more than Singapore's trade with Africa. And I have no doubt, as long as President Erdogan, if President Erdogan remains in power, I know he's facing some domestic challenges, that Turkey-Africa relationship will only grow bigger. And the reason for that is, Africa is a place where he appears to be exercising a muscular foreign policy. At one end is a soft power appeal of its brand of Islam that marries religious conservatism with industrialization and technology modernity. One spectacular showcase of this soft power is the Blue Mosque in Ghana. There's even a hospital in Mogadishu named after him. 14,000 African students have received scholarships from Turkey. Turkish soap operas are winning fans all over Africa. It has trained Somali security forces. Its drones have seen action in Ethiopia and Libya. It sells these drones to at least 10 African countries. You have this legendary Bayraktar drone, which Turkey is particularly proud of. So to answer, is Turkish influence in Africa overstated? It depends. In Somalia and Libya, it's not overstated. In Ethiopia and Uganda and Rwanda, Turkish influence may be overstated, but their leadership of these countries exercise far more agency than what the international media would give them credit for. In South Africa, Turkish influence is almost non-existent. So it depends. The same, I would say, much the same for the Gulf states as well. So UAE has invested in energy, transport, logistics. I was in Berbera back in 2018. It was a beautiful but barren seaside town in Somaliland. But thanks to DP World, Berbera now has emerged among the busiest ports in Africa. African firms have registered offices in Dubai. Dubai is often a regional head office for a lot of foreign firms wanting to do business in Africa. But at the same time, UAE is also a center from where Africa loses almost $90 to $93 billion a year through smuggling and illicit financial outflows. A lot of African strongmen and their cronies, launder their ill-gotten wealth out of UAE. Dubai's property market is particularly an irresistible draw. By some counts, 95% of the gold coming out of conflict zones in Sudan, DRC, somehow shows up in the UAE. So it's become, it's a mixed bag. And you will remember the infamous Gupta brothers who were accused of state capture by South Africa. Where did they find shelter? In the UAE. So it's again a mixed bag. How much it is overstated or how much it is understated depends which country we are talking about. In the case of Sudan, the UAE is playing a particularly diabolical role in helping fuel a civil war by backing the RSF, the Rapid Support Force. It's a militia group that has been accused of terrorizing unarmed civilians and ethnic minorities. They've backed the favorite proxies in Libya. So it's effectively ended its sovereignty. They're not the only ones to blame. There are other players in the play as well. But all I'm saying is that when it comes to these lesser great power competition in Africa, the outcome for Africa is mixed.
Right. Thank you, Amit. So much granularity to unpack there. But before we follow up, Letabo, you are a legal practitioner. You manage Amila Africa, which is a Pan-African women-led consultancy. You've written about green protectionism, about how wealthier nations are using their technological leverage to dominate green industries, sidelining less developed nations. You've written about something that not a lot of people write about, which is how countries can sort of balance moral obligations with strategic interests. Now you hear Eric and Amit talk about the great powers, the emerging powers. What does it truly mean for African governments to set the terms of its engagement with these diverse foreign investors? And what tools or strategies do you think are most effective in shifting this balance of power to what our friend Paul Nantulia always writes about, the power of the African agency? Letabo.
Thank you so much, Veda, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. It's always a pleasure to share some insights and learn from colleagues. I am the youngest, scholar on this panel, so I'm really excited to hear from the nations can sort of reposition themselves in the midst of these global realignments. Is a both complex and a very urgent discussion. I think it speaks to the very heart of development discourse, economic sovereignty, and from a legal perspective, even the architecture of international trade and investment law and policies. But before I get into that, I want to say, lately, one thing that has been quite concerning is we always speak of Africa positioning itself, and that alone speaks to the power dynamics at play that must be unpacked. One of my favorite scholars, which is Prof. Hajin Chang, has always said that late industrializing countries are often told to integrate into the global economy under existing terms, and those terms were not set by them. But in the context of Africa, I think re-entering or repositioning ourselves, in the current landscape requires that we learn from our lessons and we leverage, new partnerships and some of our lived experiences. Like some of the other panelists have said, we are witnessing a very profound moment of global reconfiguration. There are fractured geopolitics at play. We're seeing the restructuring of global supply chains, which will definitely affect African countries. We are seeing intensified competition over critical minerals. And I wrote about this for Stimson Center and what it means for the energy transition and Africa's role in the global green transition, and also the growing discourse on economic sovereignty. And I think to set the terms
Latabo, I think we've lost you a little bit. Do you want to try and switch off your video and just speak on the audio? Maybe that could help.
Yeah, she seems to have been frozen. So
yeah, I think we give her a minute.
Veda, if I could just pick up on a comment that Letabo mentioned, and I think she's absolutely right, that the path of development that not only African countries, but other developing countries pursue today is probably not going to be the traditional path, which is agrarian, light industry, heavy industry, services and tech into an OECD country. China, for the most part, is closing that pathway off because at the end of the day, industrializing is going to mean that you're going to compete against the China price, which is going to be incredibly difficult for countries. Also, one of the big challenges facing African countries, at least in critical minerals, is the difficulty of processing those minerals, given the fact that Chinese companies face or receive subsidies and whatnot. So I think Letabo made a very good point that fitting into the traditional path of development may not be the way to go. And this is where I think a country like India can play a very important role in helping to facilitate a different path based on knowledge and services and technology and innovation that maybe don't compete directly against the Chinese in manufacturing and industrialization.
Thank you, Eric. Let me just see if we have Letabo back. Letabo, can you hear us? Do you want to quickly finish the point that you were making?
Hi, yes, I am back. Sorry, I'm traveling, so I'm relying on hotel Wi-Fi, but I hope that's better. I've joined without my video on.
Yes, it's better.
And I think, okay, perfect. And I think just to echo, what I was saying before, I think Africa must assert itself currently as merely not a source of raw materials or a consumer market, but as a value-adding partner. And I think it will align very closely to Agenda 2063 and a lot of ambitions of the different AU member states for structural transformation through industrial upgrading and regional integration. I think Africa's development has long been hampered by externally imposed models that undervalue the domestic policy space. And I guess when I speak of agency, I think that the imperative is now to center African agency to frame investment and investment policies, investment laws, investment agreements, to move from an extractive model, but to a more co-development grounded model that is mutually beneficial for all parties. And I think a truly African-led investment agenda requires that we look back already at BITs, existing BITs, and maybe new age BITs and how we renegotiate them so that we built domestic investment codes like South Africa did, and align national development goals, but also with strategic, multilateral partnerships and ambitions. And I think the ongoing negotiations around the AFCFTA's investment protocol are very instructive. What we have seen is African negotiators are working to rebalance the rights and obligations of investors and host states, reintegrating provisions for sustainable development, provisions for technology transfer, and dispute resolution mechanisms that are not skewed towards investors alone, but do provide a justifiable balance between economic sovereignty of states, and then also investment protection and investor protection. But the critiques of international investment law broadly have historically privileged capital exporting nations rather. And I think to reverse this, Africa must not only harmonize investment policies through the AFCFTA, but I guess use the AFCFTA's investment.
I think we may have lost Latabo again. Okay. Eric, if I can come back to you, the point that you made about India, I want you to expand on that a little bit. But because we have you, and I think we have to ask you a China question, and because you've closely tracked this for so long, how do you think African countries are being more strategic or coordinated in dealing with Beijing? Or do you think it's still largely bilateral and fragmented? Because Litaba talks to us about, again, this question of African agency, but in negotiations with China today, have you seen a shift in the years that you've been studying this?
No, there's been a lot of talk of coordinating through the African Union to negotiate with China. But at the end of the day, those talks break down pretty quickly because the interests and priorities for Nigeria and Botswana and South Africa and Uganda and every other country is so different. That's number one. Number two, China has a preference to avoid multilateral discussions. It prefers bilateral, one-on-one. And that's what we're seeing this week in Kenya. So what's interesting is that even at FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation event that takes place every 3 years, alternating between Africa and China, that is presumably an African voice that is presenting itself to China. But yet at the same time, the sidelines are where all the deals get done, and that's one by one done by each individual African country. And we don't have transparency into the big announcements, the $52 billion that are announced. We don't know how many of those are actually implemented. We don't know what percentage, what share. I'm not casting doubt that they're not being implemented, but there's no mechanism to verify it. And that is done on a more continental level. So, but what we do see is we see the bilateral deals. We see the Nairobi Expressway. We see the standard gauge railway. We see the railways in Nigeria, and we go down the list. So bilateral is going to be still the preferred way, at least by the Chinese and by African stakeholders as well. And the African Union has not proved effective at rallying different countries to align their interests. And again, you're going to have a situation where there's just competing interests in dealing with China. And let's be very clear that the China-Africa trade relationship is one that is highly distorted. About 2/3 of imports go to just 3 countries, and about 2/3 of exports from Africa to China come from just 3 countries, and about 2/3 of imports from China to Africa go to about 5 countries. And so that really creates big distortions in how countries engage with China, and very difficult to align in a forum like the African Union.
What about you, Amit? If you could just come in at this point. So much of the Asia-Africa conversation is Sino-centric. No offense, Eric.
No, it is.
Where do you see countries like Singapore really trying to do things differently? Or do you think it's the same patterns that we're seeing?
Look, sadly, it is the structure of the trade relationship between Africa and any other part of the world is as follows. If you look at what Asia exports, it exports finished goods. What Africa exports, it exports raw materials. whether it's sends it to the United States, to Europe, China, or any other country. Even India, for that matter, has prioritized Africa in its new foreign policy with an eye on, on acquiring critical minerals. So structurally, it really doesn't change. But interestingly, Eric, what that means is that actually, if you think about it, Africa is much less directly affected by the tariffs imposed by the United States than Asia is.
Right.
Workers in Asia are going to be hit much, much, much harder than workers in Africa. But that's not to say that Africa is entirely immune to a trade shock that is coming. So the tit for tat tariff war will essentially threatens to derail the global economy, and a derailed global economy means slow aggregate growth, and slow aggregate growth means reduction of demand for African raw materials. That means less revenue for those countries who rely on those exports of natural resources. It will put further strain on their already strained budgets. The era of cheap capital had already come to an end way before Donald Trump was voted into power. Attracting investments will become even more difficult. And capital typically takes flight during such times. Emerging markets are no longer the flavor of the season. So if the cost of finance was not already high for Africa, they typically pay 6 times more than an equivalent emerging Asian economy. It'll get even higher. That will only make it difficult for Africa to finance its development. So I don't see the outcomes improving anytime soon unless unless the core somehow, whether it's regional economic communities or the AFCFTA, they come together and create a market that is unified, and then exercise the power of that market to gather investments and growth. So, but it's going to be a difficult act to do.
Thank you, Amit. I just want to quickly remind our audience at this point that how, if you have any questions, I see that we already have questions coming in. If you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A box or put your hands up, either way. Letabo, if we have you back, could you perhaps quickly respond to this tariff war, how African countries are reacting to it?
Thank you so much, Veda. It's been quite interesting, I think, from a South African perspective to see how, in as much as over the years we've said we are committed to a continental strategy and a continental point of, engaging with external partners, but as soon as President Trump started announcing some of the tariffs, Pretoria started negotiating with Washington for the possibility of a bilateral agreement. And I think we also see that, whilst we speak of continental integration and operating as a unified African market as it pertains to renegotiating and reestablishing our place in the global economy, when and if push comes to shove, African nations do look inward and negotiate from a national perspective and a national priority perspective. In one point, I think that's maybe great for national ambitions, but for a more continental agenda, I think that might undermine some of these efforts. Even when President Ruto went to the US to negotiate a bilateral trade investment agreements with the US, there was a lot of criticism because I think the general consensus is we should be dealing with this continentally and as a continent. It has been quite alarming because a lot of the AGOA countries are in fact listed in some of the countries that have been slapped with these very high reciprocal tariffs. But it also puts into question what AGOA will look like going forward and how US-Africa relations will be like going forward. Countries like Lesotho, for example, I think are are feeling the residue of having great partnerships with countries like China in developing their textile industries, for example. And so whilst we might not get hit directly, I think African industries, and especially where we have established partnerships with other industrial partners, we will see, hopefully not, but we are seeing targeted tariffs towards those countries. I mean, it does provide an opportunity to trade and look for different trade routes and trade partners. But in terms of US-Africa relations, I think it is alarming. And I want to caution, I have seen a lot of comments online saying, we'll be fine regardless. But the truth is, Africa's textile and even agricultural, agro-processing industries will suffer greatly if US-Africa trade relations are strained quite rapidly and for an extended period of time.
Right. Thank you, Latabo. And this conversation about alternative partnerships, Eric, let's circle back to the India point that you made, where you think India can add value. I'd like all of the panelists to weigh in on this, but specifically, Constantino Xavier, who leads the foreign policy program at CSEP, has a question, and he asks, what are prospects for any triangular cooperation, or India-Africa +1? In what African sectors or geographies can India tie up with other players like the UK, EU, France, Japan, Korea, or Brazil? So maybe a two-part question.
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of appetite for tripartite cooperation. It's very difficult to pull off, but the Chinese have a successful track record in China, France, working together on 7 projects worth almost $2 billion. So there is some precedent for it. There's eagerness for it. And I think at this time now where the prospect of multilateral development financing potentially being constricted, there's going to be an appetite. Also, bear in mind that in Europe, FCDO in the United Kingdom has cut their aid budget. The French Development Agency has cut their aid budget. So there may be bigger appetite to partner with a country like India, where there's more reluctance in Europe to partner with China, just given the competitive relationship. So I think if India starts putting the feelers out there to alternative countries, not just the Europeans, but again, as what Amit was talking about, we're looking at the Emiratis, at the Turks, at the Kazakhs as well, who are all becoming increasingly actively engaged. And let's not forget the Saudis. So there's a lot of opportunity here for some very interesting engagement. But I think if the Indians come to the table looking and sounding like everybody before them, which is, I hear it already in this conversation, critical minerals, raw materials, I think that's going to be rather disappointing. And I think that's just playing into 400 years of the continuous exploitation of African raw materials. This is a chance for India, which, by the way, for years has been talking up a game about how they rival China because they bring innovation, they are democracy, they bring all these different things to the table. They're English speaking. There is this kind of bond that India and Africa have historically. Let's see some delivery on that in more creative engagements beyond just we're coming to extract raw materials out. To what Latabo was talking about, which is how can African countries move up the value chain in ways that don't compete directly with China? That's the fundamental question. And by the way, that's the same question that India is facing at home as well. So that same thinking that think tanks like yours are applying to how India can compete with China should be brought into the conversation as well. There is no point in trying to build an auto factory that's going to sell cars to China, okay? Don't go down. And China, by the way, is automating at a pace that is incredibly fast, bringing down the cost of production even more. So again, the prospects for Africa to industrialize are getting more and more difficult. What are the avenues that India and Africa can work that don't compete with the Chinese? That's the space where I think we should be having this conversation.
Fantastic. Amit.
Yeah, I mean, there is immense tripartite opportunity with Japan emerging even as we speak. And the reason why that is a lot of Japanese firms, Japanese businesses are still very hesitant to move into Africa. But when they look at their Indian partners, they see that they have had the experience, they can evaluate risks better than them, and they are happy to go with India. A vivid example of this is a Japanese tractor manufacturer called Kubota. Now they are ramping up their production of very low-cost tractors and selling to Africa. The market is Africa. They're a Japanese firm, but guess where they are manufacturing it? In Haryana, in India. This is after they bought this company called Escorts. It's a very famous, iconic Indian tractor maker, for those who don't know that. But Veda and I, we know these brands. They have something called Farm Track and Power Track. These are widely sold in Nigeria, Angola, Burkina Faso, Egypt, and Tanzania. Indian agriculture equipment makers, Kirloskar, the submersible water pump. It's a byword. It's actually a verb in Egypt. They don't call it a submersible pump. They call the farmers in Egypt call it just Kirloskars. So that's how ubiquitous it is. So this is something that I see a trend emerging even in Singapore. A lot of the agribusiness trade, commodity trade that is taking place out of Singapore is largely conducted by Indian traders. So you don't see them, and they might not show up in figures, but the role of India in enhancing Africa's trade and trading link with Asia is understated.
Absolutely. Letabo, if you could quickly come in right now, and this is a big question, right? I mean, we're asking you questions, to speak for like so many countries on the continent. But from your vantage point, how is India perceived? What is the perception of India as a developmental partner? Do you see feasibility in India working with other countries on developmental projects or co-investing in many of these countries? Is there an interest for this?
Vida, I think India's increasing engagement with Africa cannot be decoupled from its role in the BRICS Plus formation. And I think that's maybe an avenue where lots of African countries are starting to get interested in the BRICS and Africa and how they can get involved in the BRICS. And I think from that perspective, it could allow for those tripartite cooperation agreements with new members like Egypt and Ethiopia joining the BRICS bloc. I think, yeah, there's great potential now to scale South-South trilateral cooperation with African countries at the center and in maybe sectors or initiatives that mobilize India's digital innovation or Brazil's agri-industrial tech or China's infrastructure capital, South African and Egypt's regional perspective and positioning. I think this could transform how infrastructure, health, and energy projects are financed and delivered on the African continent on African terms with partners from the BRICS Plus formation. I hope that answers your question.
Mm.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I do want to also allow you, Litapo, to weigh in on something Eric said at the beginning about this long-term strategic thinking in the continent. He mentioned the white papers. But what kind of capabilities do you think, like diplomatic, economic, technological, that African governments need to prioritize in the next decade to develop this thinking on how to navigate these multiple partners?
Sorry, Veda, may I please ask you to repeat that so I get the last part of your question?
Just a quick question. Eric had brought up early on this idea of African countries navigating so many different foreign investors and the need to develop strategic thinking within these landscapes. So I was wondering what you were thinking about the kind of capabilities, diplomatic, economic, or technological, that African governments need to prioritize in the next decade as things sort of are in disarray.
Okay, I think that one of the things that have come up quite a lot, and especially with the negotiation of the investment protocol, is how to reform investment protection bodies on the continent and their role and what they do, because the protocol on investment, the ACSK protocol on investment, actually specifically mentions investment protection and investment promotion as well. And so I think a continental reform and capacity building initiative around what role do investment promotion bodies play in promoting investment, but in a way that's responsible, speaking to local beneficiation, investment that speaks to local content, investments that speaks to local value creation, and sort of reforming them from worrying less about FDI volume to the quality of the FDI and who it benefits and how.
Right. Eric, would you want to answer the same question if you had to advise a room full of African policymakers?
Yeah, fortunately, I've had the privilege of doing so over the years. And a couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to brief 5 trade ministers from SADC, and one of the points that we made was that within South Africa's trade ministry, there are only 5 people, and this was last year, so I don't know if the number's been changed, but only 5 people with China competency within the trade ministry. And this is South Africa's largest trading partner by multiples compared to the next closest. And yet the capacity within the South African government was very, very limited. Durko, it's even worse. And the ministers pleaded and said, listen, we don't have the resources that other countries have to tap this kind of expertise. And I jokingly, with respect to the ministers, said, shame on you, Mr. Ministers, because every year 60,000 young Africans go to China to study. This is actually a resource that you have in abundance, and you're not taking advantage of it. And so creating pathways for young people who have experience in dealing with India, with Vietnam. I live in Vietnam. There are Africans who are in Vietnam and speak a beautiful Vietnamese, studying there and doing their PhDs there, and the same as in China. Finding pathways into companies and into governments for this talent to be able to get into the policymaking process is absolutely critical. And it is not happening right now at either a national, a continental, the AFDB, no China expertise. AU, very weak China expertise. And I think in this new era, going blind into these great power competition rivalries is just lunacy in my view. And I would like to see ways that we can find these pathways into the policymaking and corporate decision-making where you have these young people who do have the linguistic, cultural, and technical skills to really make a big impact.
Thank you. Amit, if I could bring you in at this point, you know the Indian domestic situation so well, especially the economics of it. You're very familiar with the Indian industry. Word on the street is the India-Africa Forum Summit might happen this year after a 10-year-long hiatus, right? So if you had to advise Indian policymakers on what they need to focus on during this summit, what would that be?
Wow. Okay. Right. I guess first, do more, promise less. In other words, summits, forums, speeches are great, but what really matters is the follow-up. And unfortunately, the characteristic features of Indian foreign policy has been eloquent on articulating ideas and vision, but underwhelming when it comes to converting that into action. Not every time, but quite some time. Now, Prime Minister Modi has already outlined a 10-point agenda for Africa specifically, right? We know what that is. Everybody in the government knows what that is. So set a measurable 5-year target on each of that agenda, right? And if that agenda, that goal is not met, then someone needs to be held accountable for. Second, make business travel easy and affordable. Open the Indian sky for African airlines. Give Ethiopian Airlines and Kenya Airways and Rwanda Air more landing rights at Indian airports. Remove visa restrictions. Remove visa requirements for Africans visiting the country. The more people-to-people contact there is, the deeper the economic engagement will be. So what matters most is not how many civil servants from New Delhi fly to Nairobi. What matters is how many traders fly from places like Coimbatore to Cairo. That's where rubber will meet the road, right? It's entrepreneurs who discover opportunities, not babus. And for those of you, pardon my Hindi, babus is like a pejorative term that Indians use for civil servants. So I was recently in a talk with a young trader in Rajkot, he exports refractories. These are ceramic materials that can withstand very high temperature. And he sells a lot of assorted products from Gujarat to Tanzania. But guess how he discovers this business opportunities? Not through trade shows or through Chamber of Commerce, through members of his extended family who happen to be based in East Africa. So make it easy for such people to do more. Third, see how India can assist the private sector in Africa tap into India's vibrant and very liquid capital market. Getting access to affordable finance has been a perennial problem for African firms. If India could do that, it'll make that bond much thicker. Why can't African firms list on the NSE or the Bombay Stock Exchange? Allow dual listings. India has been good at extending lines of credit that has allowed trade to flourish. Now take those lessons and apply to the wider financial market. But there is still a thick blanket of capital controls that prevents a lot of Indian high net worth individuals, family offices, and investors to invest overseas. Can these be relaxed without the paranoia that it will lead to some kind of a capital flight? Those are my recommendations.
And I also see a paper in the future, Coimbatore to Cairo. I think it's pretty catchy. But Amit, you should also know that in the audience, although very quiet, are Indian representatives from African missions. So hopefully they're listening to what you're saying, and we'll see some of this come to light later in the year. Pamela, I want you to have the last word. There is also a question that Claudine asks here. She says, how realistic is it to talk about Africa acting from a unified position when the rest of the world is becoming less unified and nations are turning inward more and more? I want to hand it over to you, but to all the panelists, this was fantastic. As always, lots of fireworks. Pamela, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'll attempt answering that as well. Thank you so much, Veda. It was really a fantastic discussion today, emphasizing the importance of African countries setting their own terms with foreign investors to ensure equitable and beneficial partnerships. I think that we've heard a lot about the involvement of traditional powers and how this, is negatively impacting Africa's development trajectory. But I think it's important also that Africa navigates these dynamics thoughtfully. We need to prioritize local development. We need to strengthen our agency by drawing lessons from India, from Asia, like we have heard. And I agree with Amit when he speaks about the diplomatic relations and how it can boost or it can hinder. We have this vicious cycle of hindering the economic growth as well. Positive engagements do foster sustainable development, but also, and mutual benefits. But this imbalanced relationships can lead to dependency or hinder the progress of our countries. And therefore, this re-imaging partnerships that prioritize local development is absolutely essential to build the sustainability and mutually beneficial relationships as well. To get to the point on the African Union and its role, I just want to quickly touch on that. I think it is vital in this process. And despite, the initial vision of the African Union on promoting unity, peace, development, the AU does, face challenges such as limited resources, bureaucratic inefficiencies that we see, and diverse political interests, even among themselves and within the African countries. So, as we enhance its effectiveness, I agree also with Latabu, who says that the AU must prioritize the reforms, but these reforms must streamline the operations and improve the financial management, as well as foster the greater collaboration among member states. I think it's really important to do that. And in order to do that, we need to leverage from the expertise and the networks that we have through this relationship of India-Africa. And the AU can drive these meaningful changes, informing the policies and strategies that empower African countries to engage in the global powers on their own terms, which is the imperative there. And I think addressing these inefficiencies and fostering the stronger unity will enable the African Union to become more effective as a catalyst for sustainable development in the long-term economic prosperity of the continent. I do agree with Amit as well. We need to put more of our planes out there, more of the African metal. It's really important because the more you have this inter-Africa connectivity happening, the more we can emphasize the economic growth and have free movement of people. So I think it was a brilliant, brilliant conversation today. As we continue to work with one another, we can only leverage and learn from each other. Thank you so much, Veda, for the opportunity as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.